Welcome to People Love Process. This movie is based on a viewer question regarding a thin line style of design and how best to approach it and work in that style. Now, I refer to this specific style as a monoline design, hence the name of this movie. And the meaning I'm pouring into that is it's one singular weight of line throughout the whole design. So in this movie, I'll show you how you can approach this style and pull it off to create final art that is very flexible in terms of usage on a variety of applications. This is a style I believe anyone can do, and it's a fun one to work in. So let's get started. We're going to start off in Photoshop because this is a style that you can use really good sourced out reference material to help you pull it off. You don't have to just draw it out of your head. All illustrators who actually illustrate full time, they're always using reference to look at things and see how they look, and then making creative decisions using that artistic prerogative to kind of twist reality and make it into a specific style. And that's essentially what we're going to do with reference. So this is a source photograph of a gazelle, and it'll make sense in context as we go along. And I picked this one because it's looking pretty much straight at the viewer who took the photograph, but it's not a perfect dead-on match, and that's okay. This is where the flexibility comes in. The first thing I do is I just cut it out from the background because I just want the head. I don't need the background, don't need the body. And I've dropped guides on top of this, so this is dissecting down through the middle because essentially we're going to end up creating a symmetric design, meaning we're only going to have to build half of it in vector form to reflect it over and get the full design ultimately. And we're going to go through all of that as we go through this movie. But as I was looking at this, I like the eye on the left side and the ear and how it relates to the horn. Now, I had done previous art in this style. Is actually the first one I did, and it was also an animal. It was an elk, and I think I referenced his antlers as horns, and all of these like hunting proficiados said, those aren't horns, those are antlers, like that. So I made sure to look up on a gazelle, and they're not antlers on a gazelle, they're horns. So I am referencing that. So hunters, don't get mad at me if you happen to be a creative watching this, because I did look it up, and gazelles are specific mammals that have horns. So, but in this photograph, I like the left side more than the right side because I don't like how the eye is this side of the head is kind of facing away from you. You're seeing more of this as he's facing forward, and that's what I want on both sides. So all I did is I lopped it in half, and I also changed, went in with the dodge tool in Photoshop, which is this one right here, and just go over the top of that, and it'll lighten in areas. So his eye was pretty dark. I wanted to see more details, so that's what I did there. And then I just chopped it in half because we just want to deal with half of this. But a gazelle's head, unlike a deer, for example, is pretty thin, especially as it gets down to its nose. And because this wasn't exactly straight on, it has a little weight over here. And this is where I made an idealistic edit. This is also artistic prerogative because I'm not creating something that is going to be photorealistic. It is realistically proportioned since we're working off of a photograph here. But I've made this selection just so I could take this and just delete it, just to trim off that edge to make it a little narrower as it goes down to the nose. And I think that'll be fine. I'll go to this layer. I'll duplicate this layer just so we get the same a copy of it. And then I'll go up here to, where's distort, transform, and then I'll just flip it like that. And then all I need to do is move it over into place. And now I have both sides. So it looks like it's looking at me straight. And that's kind of what I want. Now, I also have the right side up here, so if you don't want to remember how to do that, you can just turn that on. So I always provide these resources in the exercise file, this layered PSD, for example. But as I was looking at this, I thought the head still looks more like a deer in terms of its thickness. If you look up a photographic reference of a gazelle, their head is really narrow. So I just went in and slimmed it down even more, and I think that looks even better. And this is where, once again, I'm trying to be realistic in terms of the proportions, but I'm also trying to be idealistic, meaning a photograph is very forgiving, that is. You can have some pretty weird stuff that if you illustrated directly from a photograph, exactly what the photograph shows at times, it might look a little odd because people don't question it because it's a photograph. If it's an illustration, you have to think of what's going to communicate something more than is it 100% accurate. And it's kind of why illustration is magical in that sense, because you can do a lot of things you really can't do with a photograph. So we're going to turn on this layer because ultimately, I want these horns to wrap around what's going to be an emblem type branding for the final design context. And right now, the horns don't do this. So this is where we're going to use Puppet Warp. So if I turn this layer on and expand this folder, you can see we have the left side we originally created, and I don't have the right side in this layer because we want to do some edits first. And I've gone ahead and isolated the horn from the head. Now, I did that because technically you can go to Lasso tool and you could go like this if this was all one photograph. And then you could use Puppet Warp and it would limit it to wherever the selection, we'd probably want to lop that off down here. You could limit it to just the horn. So you could do it that way. I just wanted to make it a little easier for anybody who downloaded this file. So you can just go to the isolated horn layer itself. We'll go up to Edit. We're going to go down to Puppet Warp, and it'll give you this kind of grid. And all we want to do is place our nodes, or pins, I guess is what they call it here. And I'm going to place a pin here, and we'll place one right about there. We'll place one right at the corner. I'll do one in the middle, and then we'll go all the way up to the end right there. And once you have your pins placed, then you can adjust it. I kind of cheated. I have these guides set up so I can remember where I was going to put it. But whatever you're aligning, in this case, I'm aligning it to this element. So I just want to put a nice spacing between what will be the badge design and the figure of this gazelle. So something like that. Once you think you have it, just go ahead and click on any tool. It'll say apply the Puppet Warp, and if you like it, just click apply. And so now we have that. So that's all I do. And again, I would then go ahead and merge this down with the previous image. Go ahead and make a copy of it, duplicate this layer, and then I would go to Edit, Transform, and I'd flip horizontally. Oops. Why didn't it do that? Let's go back and do that again. Transform. And I'll go ahead and flip that. And I'd move it over. So now we have our idealistic fit for our gazelle. So ultimately, my final composition looked like this. And this is what we're going to now move over to Illustrator. And I'm going to show you how I use this reference material to draw from. And this is why I think this specific style is super easy for anybody to approach, because you don't have to be a super accomplished, you don't have to be an illustrator, let's put it that way. You can be just a designer who kind of dabbles with drawing, but I'm going to show you that it's just about making decisions on how to simplify things. So let's go ahead and move over to Illustrator, and I'll walk you through the rest of the creative process. So we're just going to go ahead and switch over to Illustrator. Okay, so this was the first design I ever did in this style, and this was the elk And I think when I first did this, I recorded a video. This was for LinkedIn Learning. And I referenced his antlers as horns and got scolded for it. So I now know that the gazelle has horns, not antlers. So it's kind of the opposite. So anyway, this is where it started. This was a fun design to create. Somebody saw this and commented on it. And so that's why I'm showing it in this video. And now I want to walk through the process of once I have my reference material. Now, initially, it started off as a thumbnail sketch. As I was thinking up what could I do for this, I thought, well, it'd be kind of cool to encapsulate an image within the framework of the horns. Now, this doesn't look exactly like what a gazelle looked like because I was just drawing this out of my head without really looking up reference, but it is kind of the principle of the design structure I wanted to create. So this was the reference we created in Photoshop. And then I just start drawing on top of this. Now I place it into an AI file, and then I create my the diamond shaped badge just to figure out the sizing. And then I drop a line just so I know the center part of it, because once again, this is going to be symmetric. We don't have to create both sides. We can just focus on one side, but this is the same way I'll draw it. I'll draw it in symmetry with just focusing on one side, knowing we'll be able to reflect it after we build our vectors. Now, my first approach at drawing, this is what I did. And I always set stuff aside and come back to it. And when I did that, I thought, I got overcomplicated with the detailing at the bottom. I don't like that. And then the other thing I didn't like was the horns itself. I don't know if you've ever seen those like candy canes on a stick that are twirled. This is kind of what this looks like because both sides are rounded. And if you always go back to your real world reference photograph of this gazelle, notice on the outside edge, it's kind of flat, but on the inside, that's where it gets curved. So I don't mind this side, but I think we need to flatten this bottom side over here. And then as it wraps up into the top part of the horn, this is cascading to the opposite side here, and it gets flat on the inside here. So those are the two things I want to change, along with simplifying my line work down below in the face of the gazelle. And so I make those kind of decisions and art direct myself all the time. Now, sometimes my daughter art directs me because she's a designer and an illustrator, and that took me a while to get used to when she started doing that. But now she has a really good eye. You're going to see that coming up here pretty soon as well. So if we turn on this refined sketch layer, actually, let's go ahead and go to transparency. It looks like I have it ready to build from. This is my final refined sketch, and you can see I simplified the line work. I still kept the same idea of what I call contour continuation, where one line kind of cascades through the entire motif and they all tie together. So I simplified the interior line work that makes up the gazelle's head in and of itself, but I also improved the horns. And I think these are going to work way, way better by just simplifying those one sides. I think it reflects what you actually see in the real world, but it simplifies it down into simple shapes. So we're going to select this. I always go to about 15, 20% like that. We can turn off our reference. I can lock the layer. Now, once I get a drawing like this done, how do I get it into Illustrator? I get people asking me that a lot now, and it's usually the younger crowd because they weren't around when flatbed scanners came out, but this is basically the exact same model I have in my studio. It's great. You can scan stuff in anywhere from, you could scan in a 72 PPI if you wanted, but I usually scan in my refined sketches anywhere from 600 to 800 PPI, and it's a high resolution. I believe this one is 800. And so that's just a bitmap TIFF I scanned in using a flatbed scanner. I might adjust the contrast in Photoshop and save it out of Photoshop. in its final form, place it into Illustrator, place it on a layer like I did here. And the first thing I'm always doing, regardless of what I'm working on, is I always try to do the simplest shapes first. What's the simplest shape in here, would you guess? Well, I would say it would be the eye. These are all elliptical shapes. Those are easy. You know, if we zoom in on this, you can see all it is 3 elliptical shapes using the ellipse tool up here. Those are the no-brainer ones. So what we want to do now is we want to build some of this line work that's in the head of the gazelle. And this is where, once again, I call contour continuation. I get that from my old design teacher, Fred Griffin from art school. And it's about carrying the viewer's eye through a composition. He was talking in context of like a layout design in a magazine, if you want, or an advertisement. But it applies to any kind of visual communication, whether it's an ad, whether it's a design in a magazine layout, or in this case, a graphic design. We're using it to kind of carry, if you start here at this end of this path, you can see this goes all the way through, all the way up here, down, and ends right at the base of the eye. The other thing about this, when you're building kind of organic vector shapes like this, it's paying attention where you place those anchor points. A lot of people will just by default say, well, those have to be placed on the tangents. Well, no, not really. If you're doing typography, that's pretty geometric, so that might be the case most of the time. But when it's a free-form shape, no, it doesn't have to be tangents. It just has to be in a location where it looks elegant. So if I select this anchor point, you can see these Bezier handles because all this curve is called a Bezier curve, named after Pierre Bezier. He was an engineer at, I believe, Renault Automobile in Europe, and he's the one that came up with the math for this to create more elegant body designs for automobiles so they weren't so boxy. A little bit of history there on vector for you. But you can see it's about using the least amount of anchor points needed, but having enough and having them in the right location to pull off the elegant curves on this. And so what we want to do is we want to build a few more. So I'm going to build the one that goes on the inside of the ear here. So we'll go ahead and grab the pin tool. I usually start where something comes to a point. So I have smart guides turned on. So if I go to the selection tool, select this, notice as I hover over this anchor point, it's going to highlight. Or if I hover over, oops, I think I just turned it off. There we go. Hover over a path, it's going to say path. If I'm over an anchor point, it's going to say an anchor point. And that's what we want because that assists us when we have the pin tool. We can go here and it said this is where the anchor point goes. This is where I want to start. So I'll just click and pull just to start it a little bit. And then I'll go up here and it's figuring out where to place the anchor point. Well, I think maybe right about here. And I'll click and pull out those Beziers. I don't try to form the whole path immediately. I just want to get access to these handles. So I pull it out like that. Then this will come down. I want it to merge somewhere with the path here. So I'll click and I'll go ahead and pull this out. Notice I'm sliding it down this path here. So it's at the same angle roughly as the outside of the ear. And that's what I end up with. And you might be saying, well, that looks pretty horrible, and I'd agree. But that's the rough build at this stage. Then I'll go back and I'll start adjusting this Bezier handle. And I think we might be able to get this whole curve of this line using just 3 anchor points. Maybe not. We might have to put another one in there. But that's always my goal, is to use the least amount of anchor points. This needs to come down like this. And then this needs to be pulled out like that. And I think that looks pretty good. Now, when you get to an end anchor, if you have 2 handles pulled out, we don't need this one over here. You can go to the anchor point tool and just click on that node for the handle and it'll retract in. Same down here. You don't have to do this, but sometimes you might want to. Now, this one looks like I pulled it down a little too far. I bet it's overlapping. If I zoom in, it is. So this is where I'd want to adjust it, just so I don't want it to come out like this, because then you have an odd space, an odd part right here. It's too thick. It's not that mono weight line. And this might be a good argument of maybe this isn't where we would want to place it. Maybe we want to place the anchor right there instead, and then we can adjust this curve like that. And I think that's kind of what we need to do. So always pay attention to those details, because ultimately it's going to affect how your art comes out when it's all said and done. Now, inside parts of his ears like this is where I'll jump to a plugin for Astute Graphics. And some people ask me, why do I show plugins? Well, because frankly, plugins make life a whole lot easier with certain things. And I don't need a plugin to do this, but I'm going to show you why I use a plugin, because I can click here, I can go down here, figure out I want it to terminate there, click there, and just pull it, and I'm done. I don't have to monkey around with any Bezier curves. Now, do you need a plugin to do that? Well, of course not. So we can go here, we can click here, and we can go down here, and I can click here. It'll fuse with the other path, and I can go to the anchor point tool. Then I can pull it out to give access to these handles. Then I can just finesse that with the handles like that. So you don't need a plugin, but a plugin just makes life easier and go a little faster. So I just wanted to show you that. And that's how I'd go about building some of these organic curves. You can see this one goes from this point where this one ends. It starts here, goes down, and it forms part of the nose and part of the upper eyelid that goes over the eye. Ultimately, we're going to select these two things, and this is where the shape building tool comes in. It's ideal for this type of building, and I'll just go ahead and get rid of that, because it will be kind of disappearing as it goes underneath the hood of its eye in that respect. Now, I just wanted to show you those, but I'm going to select the ones we just built, and I'm going to delete them because we have them on the layer here. So if I turn this on, you can see more detail in terms of the head of the gazelle. And then this path that you can see the drawing of in my drawing going all the way up here will go all the way into the horn. So it leads the eye out of the head into the horn going up. And notice on my drawing, I made a decision not to do it exactly the way I drew it. And that's how you should approach your whole creative process. If you figure out a better way of doing it as you get to a certain stage, then by all means do that. Don't just stick with it because you drew it that way, because you're never going to get everything right when you draw it out. I do it because it helps me think through the process, but I'm always willing to change it if I think something's going to look better. So let's go ahead and turn on this layer with the horn, and you can see how it goes from the inside part of the nose up to form the front part of his head into the horn. And then you have these shapes up here. So I want to zoom in on these shapes, because this is a good example of using a minimal amount of anchor points, but having enough to form the shape needed. So I'm going to start here because I want it to come out of this path as my drawing shows. It'll come up here, and this is where a tangent would come into place. And I could just pull it out like this, come here. And if you think like a car, an on-ramp for a freeway, think of this line as the freeway, and we're building the on-ramp. So I'll go a little ahead here, then I'll go ahead and pull it out. Notice I have Command U on, so it's snapping to this line, and I just pull it out enough so it's going to elegantly kind of merge into that path we already have established. So if I pull this down here, we'd probably go to right about there. I go back to this. I don't even think we need a handle coming out of this anchor point. And I might want to adjust the angle like that. And I think that looks pretty good. Again, if you want to retract this handle, you can just use the anchor point to retract it like that. Now, once you create, actually, the more I look at this, the more I think it should be like that there. Once you create one, I'm always for making things easier. So we're just going to go Command C, Command F. And all I did is clone this, and then I'll move it up. I'll grab this anchor, I'll snap it there. We might have to bump this guy over, and then I'll snap this to the path. And then I can just make an adjustment to the Bezier curve like that, and we have that one built. So you don't always have to recreate the wheel every time. You can take what, especially on something like this that has a replicated look, it's not identical for each one, but it's close enough that it gives you a starting point. Once you get that, then we can do all the rest of the horn detail. And wherever you overlap like this is where the shape building tool comes in. You can go in, hold Option, and just get rid of those little elements like that. And I think that looks pretty good. So ultimately, when it's all said and done, we have our base vectors created like this. And this is where I want to kind of figure out what weight is going to work for this. And so once I have my base vectors established like this, this is where I also want to test reflecting the artwork. So what we want to do is I want to zoom in on this, because one thing I'll point out is I don't want these horns to come to a dagger sharp end. So actually we'll just use Illustrator's rounding tool. I might have it off. Let me check. Yep, I had it off. We'll just go in here and just round those, because I think it looks better just coming to not a super blunt end, but not a dagger sharp end like that. I think that works good. Rounding it. Now we want to select everything, and this is where I'll clone it. And when I say that, all I mean is I'm doing a Command C, which is to copy it, and a Command F, which is paste in place, which makes a copy. Now I have that as a keyboard shortcut, but if you don't, once again, you just go copy. We'll do that. We'll go Command C, and you'll just go paste in place, Command F. And I also have part of my keyboard shortcut brings it to front in case it's behind other elements on its own layer. In this case, I don't think it is. Then we'll go to the Reflect tool, find a central anchor point. This is why you want to have Command U Smart Guides on. You can see it says anchor. This is symmetric, so we want to reflect it like that. Now we have everything needed. Now, because we created one half, this side isn't fused with this side. So you'll have to go in wherever they merge in the middle, and you'll have to select both anchors and go Command J, and that kind of welds them together. If you go down here to the chin, same thing. This is just one side, so we'd select both, Command J. And I'm not going to do that in everything, but you would want to do that. Now, the next thing is we want to establish the final weight of our line in context of what we're creating. And that's going to depend on your usage. So you'll have to figure out what the final usage is. And you might make, if this is a branding of sorts, you might make several different iterations of weight based off of the usage size that it's going to be used on, because that's the one thing you have to keep in mind when working with this style. Because if it's too thin and you're building, in this case, this is floating in an 8.5 by 11 vertical, so it's kind of big. So if I go too small, when it goes down small, it's going to be so faint you can't see it. So you'll have to make that determination on what weight you should use or how many different iterations. All of these are strokes minus these shapes in the eyes. So I'm just going to, need to reselect that. So I have all these strokes. You can see it's only strokes selected. If I go to strokes now, it's just 0.75. So I want to beef this up, and we're going to turn this into 1.5 like that. Click OK, and I think this weight, once again, this is a kind of a thin weight style that I'm working in. I don't want to get too fat. There's a previous movie I did on People Love, which is the lobster design. That would be a good example of the opposite direction, going really fat with your line and creating an iconic, in that case, a lobster. You can check that out to see what I'm talking about. So that's what I want to do. Now, I'm going to turn on this next layer, and I'll walk you through a few things that it's important to pay attention. And then we'll go back and I'll show you why. So I'm going to turn this on, and you can see that all these strokes are different colors. We're going to zoom in really far just to these areas right here, the left part of the ear. And you can see I've expanded these. If I go to keyline view, these are just filled shapes, no stroke. So why am I showing you this? Because if we go back to the art that we just finalized the size on, all of these, if I go to keyline, are still strokes. So we want to expand it. You don't want to leave it at stroke-based artwork. By default, Illustrator, when you create a new document, the preference by default won't scale strokes. That's usually off. And I've seen graphics that were actually printed. I noticed, oh, the vendor he didn't notice that. So when they scaled the logo on a banner, it was all screwed up because all the weights didn't scale with the size they scaled the graphic. Whether it's going up or whether it's going down, it can cause a lot of problems. So the reason why I'm showing you this is, let's go ahead and take this stroke. We'll just color this stroke yellow, and we'll color this one. We'll do this one blue. And then this one we'll just leave magenta. So all of these are strokes. Now, if I expand it, they're all 1.5 like we want. But if I go ahead and expand it now, we'll go to path, we'll go to outline stroke like this. That looks fine. Now, I want to combine these together, and here's where the problem lies. If I combine these together, because this one has this anchor here on the blue, it's going to add an anchor to this one. And it might add some more anchors elsewhere. And that's why you don't want to just simply expand and unite them together. So if we select these and we go to Pathfinder and we go Unite, notice it's going to add things like this, extra anchor points. And it really shouldn't do that. I remember asking an Illustrator engineer at an Adobe Max, this goes back about 8 years ago, showed him this, and I go, why does it do this? And his argument was, well, that's because Illustrator's too precise. And I'm like, whatever. No, it's just because it's dumb. It doesn't know better. I never had that problem when I used freehand, Macromedia freehand. Some of you might not even know what vector software that is. They were bought out by Adobe. That's why I switched to Adobe. I really didn't have a choice. Let's go back to this layer. So the reason why I'm showing you this is because I had the exact same expanding, but before I united them together with Pathfinder, I lop off areas so it won't touch this edge. That way, if I select these and I go Unite, notice it's exactly the way it should. No extra anchor points. That's the only reason this layer exists with all these colors, because it'll take you time to do this. Now, if they made Illustrator smart where it should know not to add any extra anchor points, life would be a whole lot easier. And why they can't get Adobe Sensei to figure that out is beyond me. Well, I know why. It's because nobody on Illustrator's team actually uses the software. That's why. So all I'm going to do now is just select everything with all of those areas where it overlaps, trim the way I have, and set up so it's going to build it clean. I can just hit Unite, and now everything's clean, no extra anchor points. Although Illustrator, even if you do that, will still, when you're combining shapes together, whether it's this style or another style, will create what are called redundant points. What's a redundant point? Now, I'm getting a little bit in the rabbit trail here, vector-wise, but bear with me. Let's go ahead and color this. We'll just color this black so you can see it better. What's a redundant anchor point? Well, anywhere where one anchor point is directly on top of another anchor point, and if you select your art, you won't be able to see where that is because it'll just look like one anchor point. You won't be able to determine if there's redundant anchor points. Now, ironically, in the Pathfinder palette, if we pull this out and go to the option menu here and go to Pathfinder options, there is this remove redundant anchor points, and I have it clicked to remove redundant anchor points. Oh, so that solves the problem. Well, No, it's almost like this doesn't really do anything, whether you have it clicked or not. The only time it does is when it's obvious, and I'll show you what I mean. So if we have two squares, I have that one. Let's make an inner copy. We'll make the next copy black, and I slide it over. So if I add these together, actually, let's go back to these settings so I can show you. We'll turn it off. And if I unite these two together, we'll go, where's our graphic styles? Oh, right here. We'll unite them. Notice it keeps these anchor points in. So let's undo that, go back to that setting and turn it on. Now if I unite them, it's smart enough to know you don't want those anchor points. But when it comes to a design like we just did with the gazelle and we united everything together, you will have redundant anchor points. And this does have redundant anchor points. You're going, well, how do you know that? I only know it not because Illustrator is telling me, it's because I use a plugin. It's called Astute Graphics. It's called Vector Scribe. Specifically, the Path Scribe tool has its own panel. And notice this little warning here. That means somewhere in this design is a redundant anchor point. Even though we have it turned on in our settings for Pathfinder, it still creates them. That's the irony with Illustrator. That's life with Illustrator. That's what I get frustrated over with a lot, but Astute has made it easy because it knows that shouldn't be. It detects it when it happens. All I have to do with my art selected, you can see it has 750. So let's see how many we add. We'll click this to fix it. Wow, we had 15 redundant anchor points in our design. I thought maybe 4 we might have. I had no idea there'd be 15. So that's how I fix it. And unfortunately, there is no way to do that natively in Illustrator. That's why I use plugins. I just felt I should show you that because eventually you're going to run into a situation where it causes a problem. Sometimes it won't cause any problems, but sometimes it will. So I just wanted to I know that's kind of a rabbit trail, but I think it's important enough to tell you about. So now that we have our artwork cleaned up, this is how actually I want the eyes to be. So all I did is I went in and just deleted this inner shape and made the inner areas of the highlights white itself, turned it into that. Now this is where my daughter likes to art direct me at times. So she saw this and she goes, you need to fix the nose. And I go, what? What's wrong with the nose? It needs to be black. Their noses aren't like that. It should be black. I'm going, what? And so I went in, I go, fine, let's see what it looks like. I go like that. And she is right. So I thought that was a good call on her part. Now, this is where we're going to work on the seal. So that's a diamond shape like this. And we're going to do some offsets. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to Object. And by the way, you can go to the Properties panel here. I don't know if I have it open. Let's go. Oh, there it is. If it's a simple shape like this and not a compound, it won't work on anything that has a compound nature to it. But if it's a simple shape like this, it should give you the offset path. And you can click that. And it's a faster way. If you don't use the Properties panel, you'd have to go to Object, Path, Offset Path, and that kind of takes time. So if it's a simple shape, once again, if it's a compound path, let's say it's a donut, and it's a see-through center, for whatever reason, again, Adobe won't have Offset Path come up in Properties. But if it's something like this, a diamond, click this, punch in what you want. In this case, I want to go -6 points. Like that. You can preview it. That looks good. Now from here, we want to inset it even further. So since it's a simple shape, I can go back to this and I can go, I can't remember, maybe 25? Let's turn on a layer to check. I think it's more than that. No, that looks good. So we got that, and that's the inner part of the shape. Now it's at this point where I like to go, as I'm working on something, I'm going, well, I want this to be kind of a pattern of sorts, not too complicated, but somewhat authentic to what you would see. And so this is where I just looked at African patterns. They're just cool. I'm not going to be using these colors. This will be a one color design on multiple different backgrounds. Well, I will be using some of those colors on that, but I want to get some really geometric and simple. I don't want to overpower the perimeter or the border treatment that I'm creating here, but this is where I got inspired for that. So if I turn on this layer, let's go ahead and zoom in. Once again, all these is just paths, and this is where shape blending comes in. We can go in, select these two paths, go to the shape blending tool. With two shapes selected, whether it's a filled shape or in this case strokes, you click on the anchor point of one and the anchor point of another, and it starts to blend. If you go into the blending tool, you double click it to open, go to specific steps. You can see it only has one. We want to match what we have going in the other ones, which is 3. So we'll punch in 3. You can preview it. That's what you want. We'll click OK once you've done that. This is one thing I wish they would take this out of the drop-down menu and just make it like just something you can just immediately do without having to go to drop-down menu, and that's expand. Because you have to expand it and then it pops up a window. It's like all these unnecessary steps. And this is because they haven't updated this since they first released Illustrator. So it kind of takes it. This is still going to be grouped. So if you go in here, if it says ungroup, that means it's grouped. So you'll want to ungroup it because we don't want these two. That was just to create that blend. We can just get rid of those. And now all of these elements here, I want to go ahead and select all of those because I want those to be on the opposite side. So I'm going to select those, select this. I'm going to go ahead and clone it, Command-C, Command-F, find a central anchor point with the reflect tool, reflect it that way, go to this corner and reflect it this way, and that puts everything into the right location on the opposite side like this. All of these will be the same color. Black is shown there. And this is where I'll go into strokes, and I make sure to use round. So when it gets to areas like this, it won't add an additional anchor point once we expand everything like that. Let's go ahead and just zoom in on the badge itself. All these will be black as well. So we can go ahead and color those. Go to layers. Let's put Pathfinder back where it should go, right there. We have our type, Serengeti National Park. And then we also have a nice finalized design with the nice Serengeti graphic up at top is shown there like that. So we can go ahead and let's zoom out here. And on this design, this is where it's going to be a one color design. So right now, once again, oops, looks like I forgot Savannah's suggestion here. This needs to be, I think I got the right shape. There we go. This will be gray on a white background. I think that works really good. And the nice thing about this style is it's so flexible with color exploration. And if you also use the color recolor tool feature in Illustrator, it's a great way to find other colors. But what I like to do is set up stuff like this. So if it's this dark format on a light background, just as long as the contrast you're paying attention to, this example could be green. I think that looks good. Maybe it's a tan kind of sandish color. Then maybe the line work could be like a dark brown or a burnt kind of umber type of color. That looks good. Or maybe it's this kind of pale gold. You could do a nice red color on that. That'd look really nice. Or maybe it's this kind of muted golden color and purple is always a good value to go with gold. So really flexible when it's dark on light like this. But here's the other thing. When it's on certain colors, I wouldn't want the eyes or the nose, for that matter, to be filled in like we did on the previous ones, because it's going to be light colored, and I want that to appear in the right context. So this is easier shown than explained. So if I take this, and let's say the background color is this muted kind of bluish violet, then I'd take the artwork and it would look like this. Now, if the eye was filled with the gold, it'd draw too much attention. It doesn't look right. In the opposite context, when it's the light, the dark on a light background, it actually works that way. But this is where it's flexible in terms of a style to work on any given type of usage. So this would be revising the eyes for a dark background. Here's other examples of how I'd handle it on a darker background using, once again, you have to pay attention to the contrast between the light and the dark color. If they're too close in terms of their hue and value, unless you're going for tone on tone, it's not going to work too well. So once again, this is an awesome style to work with. It's fun to use it in context of an actual photograph of the Serengeti. I just pulled this gray from the background. This was a really beautiful photograph. And it also, once again, on a dark, once again, those eyes and nose have been adjusted, but this works equally as well in that context. Now, if this is in context of a branding, this might not be the primary brand. The primary brand mark might be that diamond shape like this. Maybe it's on all of their vehicles for the national park. So it might show up like this. But once again, this would be a great style to use on their merchandise if they have a gift shop for those who are exiting after taking the tour of the Serengeti Park. You know, they could get a really cool garment like this. So this style is just a lot of fun to work in. And at some point, I want to revisit this style and do a mythical type of owl design, combining one of my favorite animals with one of my favorite styles. The monoline style is a great way to create sophisticated motifs that work well in a broad spectrum of usages such as print production, apparel design, stickers. It's also a style one could use on a wide range of client types as well, which makes it even more valuable to your creative arsenal. I encourage you to give this style a try. The theme doesn't have to be an animal, since this principle will apply to any theme you pick. So figure out what you would like to create and give it a try. Once you do, share an image with me. I'd like to see what you come up with. If you like this movie, please share a link to my YouTube channel. I'd really appreciate that. I spend a lot of time on this content, and the more people that see it, the better. And if you become a member of this channel, you'll receive original creative resources from me on a regular basis. And for those who have become members, thank you. You help me continue to create useful content for everybody. Thank you for watching People of Process. And as always, I hope this content helps you improve your own creative process.